Chapter 39. Weaving of the Web. From his attic window, Rand looked down at the crowds massing for the parade. They all walked in one direction, waving banners and pennants of the White Lion of Andor. For once, there was no signs of the tension between factions. He smiled. He'd been looking forward to this day. Only Perrin and Egwene appearing would be better. Turning, he asked Mat if he was coming. Mat lay curled up in his bed and said, "Take that Trolloc you're so friendly with." Rand exclaimed, "Blood and ashes! He's not a Trolloc. You're just being stubborn." "Light! You've heard of an Ogier before?" Mat told him. "I never heard they looked like Trollocs," then pushed his face into his pillow. Rand muttered about him being stupid, then asked how long he was going to hide. He's not going to keep bringing up his meals, and Mat really needs to have a bath. Rand left the room and leant against the door. He started to think he should send for Mother Grub, the local version of a wisdom. He hadn't done so before as he'd worried about the attention it might bring, for them and for her. Local healers were laying low with the White Cloaks in the city. No one wanted a dragon's fang on their door, and people quickly forgot who had cured them. He wasn't even sure Mat was ill. He ate every meal and didn't complain of a fever or aches. He simply refused to leave their room. As he prepared to leave the inn, Master Gil told him that someone in Caemlyn was asking about Rand and Mat and his other friends by name. Mostly it's the boys' names being spread around the city. Momentary hope faded to anxiety, and Rand asked who it was. Gil told him he didn't have a name. He only knows he's a half-mad beggar. Gil began talking about the Queen's bounty making begging unnecessary in Caemlyn, and Rand wondered aloud if the beggar could be a dark friend. Gil told him he was being paranoid. They're certainly around, but they're laying low with the White Cloaks in the city. He then mentioned rumours of strange shapes outside the city walls, possibly Trollocs, Shadowspawn, or just people's imaginations. Rand told Gil that Mat was still in their room, while he was going out into the city. Gil told him to watch himself. The Queen's men will be outnumbered today, then suggested he leave by the alleyway. There are traitors watching the inn's front. On his way out, Rand saw the inn's bodyguard, Lamwing, sat outside the front door and watching the street. Like Gil, Lamwing was a staunch Queen's man, and he warned Rand to be careful. If he stays in the inn, his aid might be useful, as he'd assumed Rand could use his sword. Rand had quickly learned that the red sword wrap signified loyalty to the Queen, while the white wrappings opposed the Queen's involvement with the White Tower. They blamed the Aes Sedai for everything that was wrong, even the weather. Rand hadn't wanted to get involved with the dispute. There were far more wearing the white than red. Normally the Queen's men travelled in groups, but today was different. The city celebrated the victory of the light over the shadow. The false dragon was being brought into the city to be displayed before the Queen, before heading off onto Tar Valon. No one talked about how only the Aes Sedai could deal with the male channeler. The crowd ran, singing and waving banners and laughing. There were 10 times more men wearing white than red, and Rand wished that the white cloth had been cheaper, though he doubted Master Gil would have helped if he'd worn the white. He flowed with the crowd toward the inner city and saw people deliberately knocking into White Cloaks, who didn't dare retaliate with the crowd's mood toward them this day. Rand dodged their notice and blended into the crowd, joining in with their song. The route of the parade was being kept clear by the Queen's guards, but people packed the edges of the streets. The inner city was built on hills, with parks and monuments all around. As he rounded a corner, he saw the palace for the first time. Pale spires, golden domes, and intricate stonework made it look like a gleeman's tale. Palace guards stood outside, creating a barrier that prevented the crowd from getting too near. Rand moved to get a good vantage, and despite how much the crowd pushed, he would not surrender his spot. Across the street he saw a beggar wearing filthy rags that people shied away from in disgust. He was scanning the crowd, and when he saw Rand, he pointed at the boy and shouted. He tried to cross the street, and Rand realized it must be the beggar who was asking about him. Not wishing to meet a potential dark friend, he began to push back into the crowd, ignoring people's curses. Breaking free of the crush, he ran until he came to a high wall and stopped panting. He still wanted to see Loghain and wouldn't just give up on that. He wandered through the inner city until he found a slope leading up to a wall, twice his height. He scrambled up the incline, then up the wall. After years of climbing the cliffs on the sand hills, the climb was easy. The texture of the wall gripped his hands, but he didn't care. The view let him see the palace clearly. The first part of the procession started to appear, trumpeters pealing the air with the sound of victory, and behind them came the drummers. Soldiers flying Caemlyn's banners rode past, flanked by pikemen and archers. 16 horses pulled a wagon holding a large cage of iron bars. At each corner sat 2 women on stools, watching the cage intently as if the crowd didn't exist. Rand was sure they were Aes Sedai, and to either side of the wagon rode the warders, who watched the crowd closely. Within the cage was a man who caught and held Rand's eyes. Logain was a tall man with long dark hair to his shoulders, and he stood holding the bars of the cage above his head. His clothes were ordinary, yet he held himself like a king. Wherever Logain looked at the crowd, the people fell silent. Then they would shout furiously when he looked away. As the wagon disappeared into the palace, Logain threw back his head and howled with laughter. He was followed by contingents of each of the nations involved with his capture: the golden bees of Ilion, the white crescents of Tyre, and the rising sun of Cairhien, and many other nations and city-states. Rand wondered aloud why the Aes Sedai were watching Logain. A girl's voice said, "They're keeping him from touching the true source, silly." He jerked around to find the source of the voice and lost his balance, falling backwards. He struck his head, and the world turned to darkness.
Thanks for listening. Please like, share and subscribe and help get a new channel off the ground. Thank you.